So, for everyone listening, you're very fortunate today to have an interview with living legend, John Seed. And we're thinking around deep ecology in relation to grief and trauma. And John has been generous enough with his time, run between workshops across the country and sort of supporting facilitators of deep ecology work, to drop in and talk to us here about the relationship between grief, trauma, group work, and ecology. So, hello, John.
Yeah, hey, Julien.
So fortunately, I've been looking for this for a while, but it just arrived by post a couple of weeks or a month ago. It's been going around, but God, it's so, yeah, it's still so, so continually relevant. Do you find yourself coming back to this work?
There's parts of it that I'm still using. There's a piece in there called the Gaia meditation that I wrote with Joanna Macey that I still use in my workshops sometimes, and the processes that are described in there. I mean, it's a little bit like a cookbook with recipes in it, and although the recipes have changed over time, actually, given that it's 35 years, they've changed remarkably little.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you a lot of questions, but I thought maybe good to start even just with an excerpt. Do you mind if I read back a passage to the audience?
Of course not. No, please.
Cool. So this is Thinking Like a Mountain Towards a Council of All Beings, the title of this work. And in the invocation that John wrote probably 35 years ago, there's a passage that stood out to me. We call upon the spirit of evolution, the miraculous force that inspires rocks and dust to weave themselves into biology. You have stood by us for millions and billions of years. Do not forsake us now. Empower us and awaken us in us pure and dazzling creativity. You that can turn scales into feathers, seawater to blood, caterpillars to butterflies, metamorphose our species. Awaken in us the powers that we need to survive the present crisis and evolve into more aeons of our solar journey. Just in reading that, John, I was really struck by, this self-transformation element, and maybe even thinking about the way that grief can transform us. And I wonder if you'd like to, if you could comment on what that stirs for you.
Well, I'm thinking about how grief can transform us, and in the spiral of the work that reconnects, which is what Joanna Macey now calls her work, which is the work that we created together and which I still call Deep Ecology. We start with gratitude and then move straight into honoring our pain for the world, which is our grief, our rage, our terror, all of the forbidden feelings, the feelings that we're never invited to share in polite company. And an extraordinary transformation always takes place in the people who are present. We create a container and we have some rules that make it safe, but a lot of people who are, well-versed in psychology are utterly horrified that we would take such what they feel to be risks of people who we've never met before. And I introduce it by, pointing out how we've been taught to fear these feelings. And we've been, that if I were to fully embrace the depth of the anguish that I feel and the terror and the rage and the horror about what's happening to my world, surely I would be crushed by this. Maybe I'd become horribly depressed. Maybe I'd commit suicide. Something terrible would happen. No, that's not what happens. I've been doing this for 35 years now. I've done it hundreds and hundreds of times. Never lost anyone. Nothing bad has ever happened to anyone. They're only feelings. They're a part of our intelligence and they're part of our healing. that it's the suppression of the feelings that causes all of the damage. And that when we are invited to embrace these feelings, and no one is obliged to step into the circle, we create a certain ceremony where people are invited, if they wish, to explore those feelings. But I let people know that the healing takes place for everyone in the circle, that in fact, one of the things that we realize very quickly is that everyone feels the same way that we do. We're all living on the same planet. We're all getting the same news. Of course, you know, we have different stories, but it makes no difference. And so it doesn't matter who steps into the center and starts to explore those feelings. Everybody gets the benefit of it. And the benefit is, first of all, an extraordinary feeling of connection with the other people in the circle. And someone just a couple of weeks ago, they described it as the metaphor that they used was the way that light can be simultaneously photons that are particles, but also waves. And that the move from the experience of oneself as an individual, as what Joanna called skin encapsulated ego, to the wave, to the feeling of just extraordinary connection and empathy and intimacy with a large circle of people who are strangers like a couple of hours previously. It's utterly astonishing. And it's part of the healing that comes from embracing these feelings. So in the cycle of the work that reconnects, we go from gratitude to honoring our pain for the world. And from there, we go to seeing with new eyes. And that's what happens when we allow these feelings. It's like scales fall away from in front of our eyes. Previously, we may have felt helpless, hopeless, it's all too late. What can one person do anyway, et cetera, paralyzed. And what I propose is that the reason that we feel that way is because we need these feelings in order to create the passion that's necessary to move from where we are. So I look back on 4.5 billion years of organic evolution on Earth, where every single one of my ancestors, without exception, was intelligent enough to reach the age of reproducing itself before it was consumed. An extraordinary pedigree. Had there been a single exception to that, I wouldn't be here. And that's true of you and everyone alive and everything alive. And 99.99999% of that intelligence was there before we grew this big bulge over our nose and started thinking our way through the world. And we can call it intuition, we can call it instinct, doesn't matter what we call it. What we experience as feelings in ourselves is what remains of that ancient intelligence that has stood the test of time. Any mammal that ran towards something, wagging its tail when it should be running away as fast as it could, doesn't leave its genes in the gene pool. This is selected for in every single generation, the extraordinary, exquisite accuracy of feelings in order to be able to judge safety from danger and all kinds of things. So when we suppress those feelings, we may understand intellectually exactly what's going on, but we're not moved to address it. We're not moved to engage. We're not moved to change anything. And so we feel helpless and hopeless and paralyzed and so on. So there's a tremendous healing opportunity in these feelings. Joanna used to call this work despair and empowerment. And when I first experienced it with her, it transformed my whole life in 1986. And it's not that she does a despair work, you know, a despair process and then follows it with an empowerment process. She just does the despair process, and empowerment is the residue that's left when the feelings have been honestly invited and listened to and celebrated.
John, that's a beautiful link in, because so the fact that just being with the grief, being in the despair itself, in company, holding those emotions together, has the flow on of this empowerment. And so I see a resonance here between your work and more recent Francis Weller's statement that we are why don't we view ourselves as a receptor sites of the earth, the earth and its suffering, and to become numb to that suffering is what creates political apathy. Do you see the connection there, or could you expand?
Oh, absolutely. And I love their work. I see the connection, but when you say in company, it's interesting because that also reminds me that in many ways, the genesis of the experiential deep ecology work was Arnie Ness's call, the man who coined the term deep ecology, his call for community therapies to heal that illusion of separation. So this isn't something that is best done as an individual, that we need to move away from the particle, move into the wave, and allow the transformation to take place in that space.
So that would be something really great for us to talk about with the group. A lot of students here studying counselling, studying psychotherapy, and it almost does feel like we're on this point where people are suddenly realizing group work is important, and it's a science, and ecological connection is important, and grief worker is important. But up until now, so much of the clinical domain has been sort of siloed. It's got like the residue of psychiatric sort of dynamics of power and pathologization. And so it's interesting to see your work, which has been going on for decades, but in so many ways unacknowledged within the clinical sphere, but then some people starting to recognize that value.
Yeah, that's right. Quite recently, I was invited to give the graduation address to a class in ecotherapy. And I've been really interested in, a friend of mine in England, Mary Jane Rust, she starts by sitting outside with her clients. She's still doing one-to-one therapy, but she sits outside, she sits under a tree, and she says it makes all the difference.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And unfortunately, a lot of our classes are mediated on Zoom at the moment. There are those problems.
But people watching could be sitting outside under a tree. And if it wasn't raining, that's where I'd be myself.
Yeah. Well, so this is interesting. So I had an interview with Tyson Juncker-Porter, who I think you've discussed and worked with just yesterday. It was interesting to sort of see the resonances between, the Indigenous perspective he brings to sort of systemic cultural issues today, and the need to bring in ancestral knowledges to address those problems. And it feels, I can see a strong, clear parallel with your own thinking around that. So,
yeah, I love his work. And one of the ways that I see the deep ecology experiential processes are as being synchronous with the ceremonies and rituals that all Indigenous societies, as far as I can tell, who maintain their ceremonies and rituals, they all have processes that allow the whole community to remember who we really are, to honour all our relations in the more than human world, and to, make sure that we don't just slowly drift away into merely social conceptions of our identity. A couple of years after Joanna and I met when she was in Australia and created the Council of All Beings, the first of the experiential deep ecology processes, I was in the United States and had the privilege to witness a ceremony being conducted by a community of Indigenous on a mesa in the southwest of the US, a tribe of Hopi. And to my astonishment, I saw that they were doing the Council of All Beings, which I thought we'd invented a short time before, but which they assured me they had been doing without pause for 10,000 years.
This is interesting.
But I imagine that they got it from the same place that we got it from.
And where is that?
Well, good question. Okay, no, I couldn't answer that, except to say that I think that the fact that these are so ubiquitous suggests that they meet some primal human need, and the ease with which people from the modern world, people who left their job in the city, you know, only an hour earlier and are now sitting in a room, the ease with which they slip into the wave space, it gives me the feeling that it's very, very familiar to us, and it hardly hidden at all beneath the surface, and that it must have been selected for over tens of thousands, and I would think hundreds of thousands of years. That natural selection, of course, works on the individual, but perhaps more importantly, it works on communities of individuals, and it works on the kinds of culture and the kinds of agreements that they have with each other. No individual can survive. It's only a community of individuals that can survive, and within that community, individuals can survive. And so I just imagine hundreds and hundreds of times over scores of millennia, there would be crisis conditions of one kind or another, and all of the small human communities, living in groups of, 150 or less, would be under tremendous pressure, and it would be those groups that were capable of meeting the challenge that would still be there, 10 or 20 years later, and then would start to multiply and split and start to fill the available niches once again. And I think that one of the things that must have been selected for was the ability of people to really attune with each other and to empathize and to harmonize with each other. And that's what this work teaches us, that compassion, to feel with.
Yeah, compassion, that feels really connected. It's interesting. One of the final notes that my discussion with Tyson ended on was, he's like, this mobile phone, I tell you what, as soon as I'm out of here, it's going in the fucking sea, So like below, he sort of spoke a lot to, I guess, the frustration, the rage, and sort of the powerlessness in writing his follow-on book, To Sand Talk, to sort of generate ideas, put them out into the mainstream without sort of industrial neoliberalism, capitalism, sort of co-opting them into some sort of other sort of destructive purpose, or like just exoticizing them. And sort of the difference, trying to tell the difference between what is real, what is out there, what is doing good, and then what is just being coerced in the service of, industry and commerce, right? So what I really appreciate in your work is there's no sort of strings attached. You go in, the group work is evident, the connection with land is evident, the grief ritual is simple. It's all simple processes that you're drawing on, yet somehow they're so profound. I'm wondering what the sort of sense that participants have when they leave the retreats or the workshops.
Well, the experience that we've had with each other is so intimate that I have to warn people that it doesn't last very long at all, and that the reason why Indigenous societies do these things over and over and over again, many, many times every year, year after year after year without pause, is because that must be in the nature of this experience, is that it's ephemeral. And but it feels like, I mean, yeah, I don't know how to express it. And so so
John, something you said to me, I said to the group, I remember at one point, was the Indigenous peoples would hunt and gather in order to come together on land in this way. So like this reversal ceremony wasn't just something that happened on the side, it was the purpose, and not just ceremony, but then I suppose the contact with how do you describe it? Contact with self in some other.
Yeah. I'm reminded that at one point there was a group traveling through a group of people that were both involved in the protests to protect the forests in Western Australia and in the Deep Ecology ceremonies there. And Joanna Macey has a dance that's part of her repertoire around the tragedy at Chernobyl, and that there's a dance and a song, and the people were doing this dance together, and an Aboriginal man came to them and said something like, "Oh, you're dancing. I can see you're serious." You know, like that. At last, here were some people who were serious.
Isn't that an inversion of the way that, you know, mainstream society treats dance?
That's right.
Well, so on that, John, so thinking like a mountain, it's an epic book, but in it you really explore, I guess, the different dangers the planet is facing, ecological crises, the things that are threatening survival of our species, and you look at how that's sort of present across like all ranges of our life. We can't escape this fact, you know. And you then from that you've entitled your piece "To Hear," I think it's "To Hear Within Ourselves the Sound of the Earth Crying." So just beginning with basics, grief work in relation to this broader subject of, would you call it eco-grief? You know, is there more? This has been a guiding principle in your work throughout, to hear the sound within ourselves, the sound of the earth crying.
Well, I mean, really, the work is a kind of a meeting between that, which was Joanna Macey's work when we met, and the philosophy of deep ecology, which posits that underlying all of the symptoms of the environmental crisis lies the illusion of separation between human beings and the rest of the natural world, and that this is a result of anthropocentrism or human-centeredness, the idea that human beings are the center of everything. And so to hear within ourselves the sounds of the earth crying speaks to one part of that, and that's actually a part of a quote from the late Thich Nhat Hanh, where he was once asked by some students. They said, "Sir, what's the most important thing we can do for the healing of our world?" And his reply was, "The most important thing that we can do for the healing of our world is to hear inside ourselves the sounds of the earth crying." And I contemplate this and can only think that he would say this because it's only if we're prepared to hear those cries that we can address them. That if we refuse to hear the cries, if we take everything personally, if we assume that all of those cries that we hear is because I was weaned too early, or, you know, or because I was bullied at school, and we only look at our personal history in order to understand why I feel that way at 3 a.m. when I wake up suddenly, you know, and where those feelings come from, then we're sidelined. And I mean, then the question is, in whose interests is it for people to be spending all of their time dealing with their inner child rather than, why are we feeling like a kind of helpless rage instead of outrage? You know, that in order for the rage to point outwards and for that passion to actually move us into making changes in the world, we have to actually experience it that way.
This is like, you know, stuff for people to think about coming into this work, right? It's such a pivotal, like, and it's not to deny the importance of attachment theory or to understand formative traumas and how they can shape you, but how does that orientation feed the individualist, atomized sort of approach, which in some ways bolsters a society, well, the globalized sort of situation that we're in now is, really interesting point to come into. Yeah. So in this way, then you're talking about the way that human grief is inextricably connected with ecological anxiety. And one thing that struck me in your work with Joanna was this recognition that the destruction of the life systems that support us is actually a deep, pervasive source of anxiety for us, even if people don't express it. Could you speak to that, like that lack of expressing it? Like what's the block? Or?
Well, I mean, we're discouraged from expressing our feelings. You know, boys don't cry, girls don't get angry. Our feelings are suppressed. You know, boys that cry at school have a hard time. There's all kinds of mechanisms for making it difficult, and rarely is there an invitation, even from, you know, a close friend, to that, you know, the moment that we start to get into our feelings, the people that we're with will either change the subject or try and fix it straight away, you know. And the idea of just allowing the feeling some space to be in the world, you know, it's just not part of our culture.
And that I feel like that's almost my entire job here. It's a funny thing. It's like, okay, well, look, if something comes into the room, if you get to the point of inviting the grief into the room, why don't we just sit with it for a moment rather than dismissing it? So I remember reading and thinking like a mountain. So you spoke both to that way in which culturally there are narratives or that actors create taboos against the expression of grief. And then you also spoke to the fact that the numbness and the apathy that is so generalized doesn't actually result from ignorance or sort of an indifference, but rather awareness that of planetary destruction on the deepest level. But it's something we can't integrate for fear that we're going to fall into despair and be overwhelmed. So that's sort of, as speaking to what you were mentioning, you had this critique from psychologically minded people of being like, oh, how could you bring people into workshops you don't know? Maybe they don't have capacity. Do you think that that is actually in some ways a symptom of this broader cultural idea that we can't hold the dark emotions?
I think so. And of course, you know, I'm doing another workshop starting tomorrow, and I may suddenly be proven wrong, you know. But my experience is that when we have an agreement of confidentiality, which includes, of course, that nothing that you hear in this circle is going to, you know, you're not going to talk about it at a party next week. But it also includes nothing that you bring into this circle is going to be, no one is going to start to talk to you over dinner tonight about something that you raised in this circle. That you can go anywhere at all, and it'll never come back to haunt you in any way. So there's a tremendous kind of a freedom that's created by that, where people don't have to hold on for fear of being exposed in some kind of a way.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about, I don't know if you've had a chance to watch Franklin, the documentary yet?
Yes, I have.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I watched that. I thought about, so was the deep ecology movement involved in that? Because it was incredible, the power of the protesters, their ability to stick it out, you know.
No, that was 1982, and I had just run into deep ecology then, but there was no deep ecology movement at that time.
Okay,
but
so
yes, but I would say that, you know, when I look at the kind of ceremonies of empowerment, I would include direct action as being such a ceremony. That, you know, that you might think that you're doing something that's strategic or political or something like that, but it's extraordinarily ceremonial and symbolic. That you can't actually, with your body, stop the bulldozer. All that you can do with your body is to create an image that gets flashed over the media, and that awakens compassion and sympathy and feelings in you know, millions of people. And that's what happened, you know. So I feel like deep ecology grew out of those actions more than, you know, rather than supported those actions.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So, I mean, I'm interested in thinking about this then. I guess this growing out of this relationship of interconnection between the action in the real world, the protest, and then the contact of your own emotions, that experience. Maybe could you speak at all to general systems theory and thinking, and how that connects into deep ecology work?
Yeah, I mean, this is very much Joanna Macey's forte, and it's not something that I've really, I can't even say that I've understood it very well. And so I'm afraid I can't, but perhaps you could say something about that. I'd be really interested to hear more about what you mean by that.
Oh, when I think of the general systems, I was interested in a number of the connections that you bring out in your workshops between, for instance, the scale of the universe. So like, and different, like when I understand general systems theory and complexity thinking, there's a lot of attention placed on basically challenging linear, reductionist, simplified sort of narratives, and seeing our place in the greater scale of things and the interdependence between the parts. So could you maybe run through any of sort of those sorts of exercises, the activities that you might explore?
Well, so gratitude, honoring our pain for the world, seeing with new eyes. So seeing with new eyes used to be a lot about, we would borrow ceremonies from different indigenous groups. I remember we used to do a dance called the Cherokee dance, and then discovered that indigenous people didn't look kindly upon that at all, and just felt like, having ripped everything else off, now we were ripping off their spiritual life. And so I started looking for our own seeing with new eyes processes that would allow us to move from ecological ideas to ecological identity. And two of the processes that I use now are, one's called the Earth as Peppercorn, and it was created by the professor of astronomy from the University of South Carolina, Guy Otwell. And he, in his introduction, he says that if you want to create enthusiasm in a person of any age for astronomy, for the solar system, for the galaxy, there's nothing better than this exercise. And what we do is we create a scale model of the solar system based upon the Earth being the size of a peppercorn, and then we walk from the sun to Pluto, and we have objects of appropriate size, and we measure our walk, and when we've walked, you know, like 95 meters from Mars, we get to Jupiter and place a walnut at Jupiter. That's the sun is a small pumpkin or a rock melon or something like that. So and the experience of walking to Pluto gives one a tremendous sense of the scale of things, and helps to create the kind of humility that deep ecology calls for, because what deep ecology is saying is we're not the spider in the center of the web. We're just one tiny strand among 10 million strands in that web. And as we destroy the other strands, we destroy ourselves. And this process gives us a visceral sense of this.
Really sort of interesting the way that you bring in ritual, ceremony, initiations of sorts, expression of emotion, expression through movement, dance. It seems in so many ways that you bring back these cultural practices that have been with us for thousands and thousands of years, but have been somewhat dismissed in like a quite a narrow frame of what it is to create health. You know.
No, that's right. I mean, I wonder if we're the first culture in 200,000 years to have dismissed these practices as being empty ritual or mumbo jumbo, and whether the extraordinary destruction of our life support systems, which we seem incapable of preventing, that we'd seem unable to slow our slide to oblivion, may be a consequence of having let go of the kinds of cultural practices that every other society uses in order to rein in that kind of human arrogance and expansion.
Thinking on that, John, thinking about an excerpt from the book where you talk around, I guess, those cultural activities in connection with ecological thinking. And you're right, ecological thinking requires a kind of vision across boundaries. The epidermis of the skin is ecologically like a pond surface or a forest soil, not a shell so much as delicate interpenetration. It reveals the self ennobled and expanded as part of the landscape and the ecosystem. Because the beauty and complexity of nature are continuous with ourselves, we must affirm that the world is a being, a part of our own body. Wondering, even the notion of interpenetration there conjures up general systems theory and thinking about the self as extended and how your work brings people to that awareness. Could you speak to that a little? Whatever comes to mind for you.
Yeah. Deep ecology is better communicated through poetry than it is through discourse. And what comes to me is a poem from one of the ancestors of the deep ecology movement, the late Robertson Jeffers, an American poet who wrote his best poetry, including this poem, in the 1920s and 30s. And this poem is called Signpost. Arnie Ness said that ecological ideas won't save us. What we need is ecological identity, ecological self. And this poem, I think, speaks to that, although it was written a long time before the term deep ecology was coined. I entered the life of the brown forest, the great life of the ancient peaks, the patience of stone. I felt the changes in the veins in the throat of the mountain, and I was the stream draining the mountain wood, and I the stag drinking. And I was the stars, boiling with light, wandering alone, each one lord of his own summit. And I was the darkness outside the stars. I contained them. They were part of me. I was mankind also, the moving lichen on the cheek of the round stone. They have not made words for it. To go beyond things, beyond hours, and be all things in all time. In the motionless and timeless centre, in the white of the fire, how can I express the excellence I've found? Robertson Jeffers.
Thank you, John. And with that, on ecological identity, perhaps the best way, as you're saying, is for students who are interested in exploring ecological identity and experiencing it. It's really about finding a community, whether deep ecology community or otherwise, that they could participate in.
Yep.
And it seems like deep ecology is growing in the Australian context.
Well, yes. I mean, all of a sudden, I was out of the loop for a couple of years with some serious health issues. And as I returned and found my enthusiasm and energy were, you know, surging forward again, and I started organising workshops. To my astonishment, the workshops filled up really quickly in a way that they never had before. And, you know, I did a workshop in Melbourne in November and it was full with a waiting list. And so I organised another one for February and that filled up in a week. And so I organised a couple more. And the same thing's happening here in Tasmania, where I am now, and on the north coast of New South Wales. And so I've started inviting co-facilitators to, I have 2 co-facilitators in each workshop, because I'm hoping that we'll look back in a few years' time and see that this was indeed just a little inflection point on what was going to become a virtuous J-curve for a change, and that I'd hate to be caught flat-footed without people that were feeling empowered to facilitate this and to offer this. And so I'm doing quite a lot of work at the moment on creating that community and empowering that community.
Well, and on that, well, what I'll do after the show is I'll have some details so you can follow up John's work, and you can keep track of the Deep Ecology workshops across the country, wherever you're located. Hopefully there's something not too far away, or at least in the coming years as it expands. But also, maybe just to clarify again, we're talking for those psychotherapy and counselling students who are really interested at the meeting point of group work, what real group work has to offer, grief work, actually contacting grief in group ritualized processes, and ecological ecology self-connection. This is a really beautiful opportunity that you have available to you. I suppose on that note, I'd like to ask you, John, just because I'm aware of time, what is it too that you would like to share with counselling and psychotherapy students of grief and trauma? What do you think you'd like to leave them with?
Well, I guess I don't have much background or experience of working with people on a one-to-one basis, but I've just noticed working in groups that the whole group lifts up in the process, and people who were feeling really broken and damaged in the first sharing have kind of left that behind. And I by the end, and I don't mean that they've left it behind permanently at all, but just that how is it that we feel as broken as we do, you know? And it's like, partly it's because we've had certain traumatic experiences, certain things that we've found damaging, and partly it's because there isn't another note sounding that is louder than that note, you know? And so that there's just something about, you know, being with a group of people, working on a common project, being engaged in protecting the world, which, I mean, in my own life, I experienced myself as terribly broken as a boy and as an adolescent and as a young man, and I don't think that was ever healed. I don't like. It's just been sort of pushed aside. It's just been another note is much louder than that note now, you know, and that so to encourage both the students and then later the people that they're working with to find a way to engage in some kind of a positive to be able to identify that a lot of the pain and the brokenness isn't personal, you know, that it's coming from the world, and that it's best fixed by trying to fix the world rather than by trying to, you know, fix the person. I don't think I've said that very well, but
yeah, and John, and the fact that you'd speak to if helping the person happens in community, happens in relationship and group expression.
But anyway, Julien, you would, you know, the reason that I'm here is because you participated in a workshop a few months ago. Why don't you say something about what your experience was of it? Because I feel like you speak the language of the community that we're talking to. You know, it's your first tongue. You know, like I speak with an accent. So how would you say?
It's important to bring more accents into mainstream therapeutic dialogue, right? I think that's the important part. It's been monolingual for too long. So that's again why, you know, inviting yourself, inviting Tyson to give presentations. One thing that comes to mind is what you're describing there. There's a real resonance with Yunka Porter's description of some of the grief processes in Indigenous communities. He was speaking a bit about how he lost a sister recently, and sort of the different ongoing processes and stages for addressing that take long periods of time, and they involve often public wailing rituals, you know, of sorts. Like they involve, like they're outwardly expressive, and you're sort of you speak to the way in which as a young man that was not possible. And I think that's true for myself, for a lot of men, and more generally through society too. We don't really have grief ritual. We have one thing that came to mind for me from the book, again, thinking like a mountain, was this phrase: this refusal of feeling takes a heavy toll on us, impoverishing both our emotional and our sensory lives. It also impedes our capacity to process and respond to information, as we screen out or filter anxiety-provoking data. But such feedback is precisely what we need to adapt and survive. And that actually spoke directly to something that Tyson was saying yesterday, that creatures that don't respond to the feedback they're receiving from the system, well, they just die historically. And that speaks to what you've connected to as well. If you run towards, you know, a predator, you just die. That line ends. And we're not responding to the feedback that we're getting culturally, you know, in our own bodies. We've almost forgotten that our bodies communicate to us. So I really appreciate how, again, you know, approaches like yours are offering real alternatives to sort of reconnect people to some past.
Thank you.
I thought there was maybe I could read also a little section on group work, because again, I think for people who haven't done group work, they haven't sort of seen the value. I teach a group workshop, right? And there's such a difference between, I guess, group work like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you might stand up, you say something, but there's no sort of re-engagement. You know, you're witnessed, you're part of the group. That's potent. But there's something different about, just forms of group work where you're in circle with a group of people, and there's this real vulnerability and disclosure, which is possible in something like AA, but it's different. So this section and maybe you could comment on it afterwards, but experience with group work has shown that despair, grief, and anger can be confronted, experienced, and creatively channeled. Far from being crushed by it, new energy, creativity, and empowerment can be released. Unblocking these feelings also opens us to experiencing our fundamental interconnectedness with all life. Often after such experiences, people come together to form ongoing support groups or join existing groups to take action on peace and or environmental issues.
Yeah, well, what I'm seeing is I just get this sense that these feelings aren't socially constructed. They're hardwired in us. They're part of our intelligence. They've been selected for 4 billion years to guide us through the world. And when we see something in the world that triggers a feeling of, so let's say, anguish, that's pushing up with a kind of a primal energy, and it meets a force pushing back down again with an equal and opposite energy, which is saying embarrassment, or which is saying fear, or which is saying, you know, my social standing is going to be damaged if this is allowed, and so on. And so these two powerful opposing forces are locked in pushing against each other, and our life force is consumed in this way. You know, that what remains is just the residue of that. So that when we remove the, you know, when we can create a container, a safe place, a group that invites those feelings, that celebrates those feelings, that when each person sits down in the circle, the rest of the circle says, yes, we hear you, you know, like it's very positive kind of a response to the feelings, then not only is the tremendous primal instinctive energy of those feelings released, but the energy that had been suppressing them is also released. And that, I think, is the empowerment that we then experience, and the elation and the upliftment and the sense of solidarity with all of the other people who witnessed that with us.
I think it's really great to be sharing this with students live too, because there's this, I think, almost this fear of group work and that potential, and a failure to recognize what it has to offer. So in the therapeutic domain, Yalom was like, he wrote like the seminal work on group work, and reading through his work, I just see how much it naturally fits with the Deep Ecology sort of project, and that you don't have to go off and do a 2-year master degree in group work in order to start trialing it. Because I imagine when you guys are doing when you start formulating deep ecology and the work that reconnects, it's trial and error to some extent, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. But the piece that I would add is that I think that what protects me, you know, the reason why I'm not afraid, even though people who, you know, are steeped in psychology recoil in fear when they see what I'm up to, you know, is because everyone who comes into the circle is there because of their intention to heal the illusion of separation between themselves and the living earth. There's no other reason to be there. Indeed, the only times when this work has just fallen flat is when, trial and error, I was invited by a teacher to give it to a class, or I was invited by the marketing manager for a big corporation to bring it to his team, you know, and there were people there, obviously, you know, who were smiling politely, but inside they were groaning like, oh, give me a break, you know. And that even if there's one person there who's not there with the right intention, the whole thing doesn't work. It requires every person to willingly be part of the circuit, and to allow the energy to move through the group, and to allow the group to turn, instead of a bundle of discrete particles, into a wave with a life of its own. And so I can imagine that we could bring a group together for other reasons, such as, for example, personal healing, where the reason why people are at a group are there because each of them feels broken, and they're at the group in order to see if we can help each other. And this seems totally valid, but I have no experience with it. I have no idea what happens then. I have no idea whether that group is protected in the way that I experience the groups that I'm part of to be protected, where nothing ever goes wrong. Nothing bad ever happens to anyone. No one leaves the circle and disappears and we wonder what's happened to them. Do you know that, like, it's very, very, how can I say, it's very noisy sometimes, and it's very startling. And I'm sitting there and I notice someone is just flipping out in the center of the circle and people just start glancing at me. And my role as the facilitator is just to be like, it's fine, like nothing ever goes wrong here, and nothing ever does. However,
John,
that's in this particular context.
Yeah, well, I think, yes, that's really worth commenting on, right? And not just dismissing. So it's interesting, again, when I was speaking with Julien Tempone yesterday, there was this, we began by talking about the fact that there are ritualized, respectful protocols of engagement in yarning, in connection, in circle, in ceremony. There's a body of law, there are knowledges that protect us, right? And so they, if I go to address and contact like an elder, that then there's protections put in place through that respectful engagement. So it's interesting to hear again this resonance between Indigenous ancestral knowledges and the work you're doing, that people are turning up there with an intention which isn't self-serving. It's the intention is recognizing the greater connection with nature, their interconnection. It brings to mind something that you wrote in your activist work, again in Thinking Like a Mountain. You wrote, I was gripped with an intense, profound realization of the depth of the bond connecting us to the earth. I knew then that I was no longer acting on behalf of myself, but on behalf of the earth, my larger self. I was literally part of the rainforest defending herself.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a podcast that I heard yesterday. The Buddhist teacher Tara Brach, and she was talking to a guy, Dan Siegel, about something like this, and he brought up a metaphor that there's a grove of, I think they were quaking aspen trees, that there's 10,000 trees in a grove, and when they looked underneath, they discovered that they were all connected, and indeed they had a single DNA, and that it was just one creature, it was one being, and on the surface it looked like 10,000. And then Tara Brach responded by saying, well, perhaps we're like that, where the earth itself is the root ball that connects all of us, and that one way of looking at us would have us all as separate individuals, but in another way we're all connected through the earth out from which we're born, and to which we return, and without which we have no existence.
That's it makes me think too. I'm curious to get your perspective on that. The way that sort of ancestral wisdom practices or ancient wisdom traditions from the East, from Indigenous cultures, are being integrated into therapeutic domain and mainstream culture. It's easy to see like the way that they're sort of decontextualized. They're carved off a lot of the cultural baggage in order to secularize them, and in that process often lost a lot. I'm thinking about, for instance, say you mentioned a Buddhist teacher, how say mindfulness techniques are often done in isolation. They're often, and they might still have really positive effects, but what strikes me as interesting is the group work that you offer with this nature connection and this expression of emotion. It really feels like relational meditations. Could you speak to that at all?
Not really, but I like it. I hadn't thought of it that way, but that makes a lot of sense, Julian. Thank you.
Well, there's so much that I'd love to keep talking to you about. The hope, the ambition is in the future that there might be ecotherapy run at ACAP. We can start generating those sort of electives for students, and if that happens, if you're free, although I know you're running around the country doing all sorts of things at the moment, it'd be lovely to have you on again. And
thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Julian.
Thank you for your time. Enjoy the retreat, the workshop.
Bye.